Regarding climate change, public opinion has become so cluttered with lies and deliberate misinformation. In the past, journalists and news agencies took the task of honest reporting upon themselves. The legacy of Edward R. Murrow lives on. But muckraking seems to have proliferated the web medium unabashedly, which makes Twitter all the more amazing since the nature of followers and following builds with credibility and the merit of one's ideas. The question that I tried to ask Jen Gerson had to do with the line between news and muckraking, as opposed to the nebulous idea of hard or soft news. Certain newspapers of News Corp are just garbage publications, bent on muckraking. William Randolph Hearst became famous for muckraking. How terrible is the reputation of Sun newspapers or even Fox News? Forget the examples and ask whether this kind of journalism has a place in public discourse. I'm not trying to stifle or censor differing opinions. The quality of journalism is not simply an industry going broke. The perception of the degradation of news has to be, in part, stem from this lack of responsibility or accountability. No one questions the rightward bias of certain news organizations, but please explain to me why the mainstream media has an inherent liberal bias, or the fact that most university professors statistically identify themselves as liberal, or the fact that the more education one receives correlates strongly with more liberal political leanings. Ignorance is the enemy here, and when news propagates ignorance through lies and misinformation, that should be held to greater scrutiny. The ignorance over climate change shocks me. My own personal ignorance on the subject now seems unfathomable. What I learned about how energy deeply affects climate and world economies is staggering information, which will affect how I will pursue policy moving forward. But the voting process doesn't operate through a meritocracy. How we choose elected representatives and select national priorities doesn't follow from the meritocracy of ideas. Ignorance plays too large of a role, and how some segments of the media has either been corrupted by economic special interest or through deliberate misinformation is beyond irresponsible. What Anthony Weiner did last summer wasn't substantive policy news, but was meaningful in a number of ways. It wasn't soft news, please pardon the pun, but garbage like the birther controversy of Barack Obama or investigations of whether John McCain's adopted Bangladeshi daughter was a child he fathered out of wedlock have no place in public discourse. If they're true, fine, that's legitimate news. The same thing happens with climate change. The game has become how many false accusations can one gin up against climate change. The ClimateGate controversy turned out to be completely non-substantive to the scientific data. Boykoff's book went into some length about how the truth didn't matter. The perception of these researchers at the University of East Anglica was so thoroughly trashed that the truth didn't matter. Forget that 8 different committees investigated the researchers for fraud and found no evidence of misconduct. Forget that the scientific consensus remains anthropogenic climate change. All we hear is debate and controversy. I understand the need for a public relations manager to control public image. Jimmy Kimmel recently delivered the keynote address at the White House Correspondents' Dinner and delivered a stinging criticism of media and journalism at the end. Kimmel described journalism as in decline, having become too politicized, too focused on sensationalism, and no longer honoring the duty to inform Americans. Rather, he continued, journalists try to actively divide the nation so that their corporate overlords could rake in the profits. The punchline was that he didn't even have a joke for all these things that people say about journalism and received quite a bit of ironic applause. I know for a fact that there are honest, reliable, credible news sources, but the popularization of news has led to such an explosion of sources that simply aren't true, and that lack of distinction between reliable and unreliable news is a major social danger. Despite knowing the risks of climate change, I offer no real public policy solutions. I know that China and India will continue to massively rely on coal-fired electricity generation for at least the next 30 years. That's our reality unless something dramatic happens in the energy generation industry. More carbon dioxide will be pumped into our global atmosphere in these next 30 years than the last 50, even if the rest of the Western world hews to emission standards like the Kyoto Protocols. So why would or should the Western world cut back on emissions, knowing that China or India will irreversibly tip the scales anyway? There's no global authority that can judge China or India for following this route, but at least I acknowledge the risks, knowing the science behind the impending climate harm. That's more than the general public can say. I want to know where the responsibility lies in the pursuit of honest, factual public discourse. The media, especially social networking and new media sources, share in that responsibility, but I have deep doubts on this accountability. Who watches the watchers?